On the gray morning of November 20th, 1985, beneath buzzing fluorescent lights in Redmond, a handful of engineers gathered around sluggish CRT monitors, caffeine clutched in trembling hands. The air was thick with anxious anticipation and the faint tang of solder. A flicker on the screen, polygons shifting, tiled boxes chasing the mouse's hesitant clicks. These are not just Windows. They were the first visible hints of a revolution. Windows 1.0, humble and halting, was poised to reshape the future of computing. From the sparks of invention to the battles that shaped the digital age, Tech Tales dives deep into the stories behind the world's most influential technology. These are the breakthroughs, the rivalries, the triumphs, and the spectacular failures that changed history. Told in rich detail, each episode takes you inside the moments where innovation met destiny. And the world was never the same. The early 1980s were a crucible for personal computing. In 1981, IBM placed its fate and that of an industry in Microsoft's hands with MS-DOS powering its new personal computer. The result, a machine whose heart was a blinking cursor and whose soul lay in typed commands. Yet the very world around it was morphing. The command line, with its cryptic prompts, stood increasingly at odds with the human desire for immediacy, intuition, and the graphic elegance of pointing and clicking. In 1981, Bill Gates caught sight of the future at Xerox PARC, where overlapping windows floated on glowing screens. The promise was clear: computing should feel tangible. Apple, ever the evangelist for ease and design, rolled out the Lisa in 1983. Though priced far beyond most budgets, it painted a vivid picture of what a GUI could be. Icons gliding like dancers across a desktop. A year later, Apple introduced the Macintosh, a compact wonder marketed with the iconic 1984 ad. It wasn't just a computer, it was a cultural moment, a manifesto that computing could be as accessible as flipping a page. Microsoft found itself at a crossroads. The DOS empire it had built was firm, yet its future seemed insecure without a response. How could a company steeped in corporate licenses and command prompts shift into the realm of icons and intuition without alienating its base or provoking Apple's ire? "It was like we both had this neighbor named Xerox," said Gates later. The metaphor was charitable, but tense. Apple accused Microsoft of theft. Gates countered with a defensive jest. Yet beyond the courtroom drama, Microsoft engineers labored to thread the needle, create a graphical layer that ran atop DOS, that looked sophisticated but could function on modest hardware, that leveraged Microsoft's software catalog but didn't blatantly echo Apple's look. The landscape they faced was chaotic and uneven. IBM-compatible PCs came equipped with 64 kilobytes, 256 kilobytes, or, if you were fortunate, 384 kilobytes of RAM. Hard drives were optional gems. Floppies clicked like anxious hearts. Graphics adapters varied wildly. CGA, EGA, TGA, all with quirks that threatened uniformity. Networks? Still a fringe. Multitasking? A dream. Yet beneath the patchwork, ambition simmered. A belief that computing was heading toward ubiquity and that Microsoft, through volume and vision, could steer its course. Inside Redmond, Gates, graphical pioneers like Tanny Trower, and a mix of fresh programmers and veterans worked in tension. Could we craft something elegant, or at least useful enough? Their answer coalesced as a shell, Interface Manager, promised in 1983. By November 20th, 1985, the name had transformed into something clearer, something sturdier. Windows 1.0, a graphical environment interacting with DOS underneath. It launched to manufacturing that day, and Europe waited until May 1986 for version 1.02, introducing new languages and support, foreshadowing the ubiquity Microsoft would demand. Despite its ambition, Windows 1.0 staggered under criticism. It demanded 256 kilobytes of RAM, a significant bar for many, and performance was, in one scathing review, likened to pouring molasses in the Arctic. The tiled layout felt constrained. The mouse, still a novelty, felt alien to keyboards and lines veterans. Yet resisting the bleak forecasts, Microsoft pressed onward. The first tile, as awkward as it was, had been laid, and with it began the empire of Windows. The seed that would grow into Microsoft Windows was planted years before its public unveiling, in rooms lit not by marketing spotlights, but by the cold glow of research terminals. In 1981, Microsoft was riding the wave of its MS-DOS deal with IBM, a contract that had put Bill Gates and Paul Allen's young company at the very heart of the PC revolution. But even as DOS spread, Gates was restless. At 25, he had already been in and out of Xerox PARC, where the Alto computer had shown him something startling. A desktop filled with resizable windows, icons representing files, and a pointing device that turned the abstract into the tangible. It was a glimpse of the post-command line future. The moment crystallized further in late 1982 when Microsoft was contracted to produce software for Apple's upcoming Macintosh. Their development teams saw firsthand how Apple was integrating the graphical interface into an accessible, consumer-friendly package. Microsoft's own engineers began sketching out an idea, not a complete operating system, but an environment that would sit atop DOS, translating its cold, blinking cursor into something visual and intuitive. Internally, it carried the pragmatic codename Interface Manager. This was not a universally popular idea inside Microsoft. Many saw it as a dangerous diversion, especially given how niche GUIs still were in the PC market. DOS was entrenched. The IBM PC and its compatibles were thriving on text-based applications. Memory was scarce, graphics cards were inconsistent. A graphical interface, some argued, would only run slowly and frustrate users. But Gates had one thing on his side, an obsession with staying ahead of the curve. "We can't wait for Apple to own this space," he told his team. If GUIs were going to be the future, Microsoft had to be there, even if the hardware wasn't ready yet. In November 1983, at the Comdex trade show in Las Vegas, Gates took the gamble. Without a finished product, without even a solid ship date, he stepped on stage and announced Microsoft Windows. His promise was bold. This new environment would allow multiple applications to run side by side, make computers more approachable for non-technical users, and open the PC to a wave of new software possibilities. It would ship within a year. The announcement rippled through the industry. PC Magazine called it an ambitious bid to redefine the personal computer. Apple's reaction was less charitable. Steve Jobs saw it as a direct threat to the Macintosh and accused Gates of theft. Gates, in what would become a legendary retort, quipped, "Well, Steve, I think there's more than one way of looking at it. It's like we both had this rich neighbor named Xerox, and I broke into his house to steal the TV set and found out that you had already stolen it." Behind the scenes, reality set in. Development was harder than anticipated. Windows had to support multiple graphic standards, CGA, EGA, Hercules, different mouse drivers, and work on systems with as little as 256 kilobytes of memory. The team wrestled with performance bottlenecks and a still immature mouse and pointer vocabulary that many users simply didn't understand. Deadlines slipped. The one-year timeline stretched into two. Skeptics derided Windows as vaporware. But on November 20th, 1985, Microsoft finally released Windows 1.0. It was not a revolution, at least not yet. Windows 1.0 featured tiled windows that could not overlap, a clunky menu bar, and rudimentary versions of familiar programs like Calculator, Calendar, and Notepad. It required a mouse, which few PC users owned. The press was polite but unenthusiastic. Many saw it as a curiosity, a technological sideshow to the main act of DOS. And yet, that release planted something deeper than a product. It planted persistence. In those tiled windows and halting redraws, was the conviction that GUIs would one day be standard. Microsoft had taken its first public step into a future it intended to control. When Windows 1.0 arrived in 1985, it barely made a dent. Sales were tepid. Reviewers complained about its clumsy tiled windows, sluggish performance, and the fact that you needed a mouse in an era when most PC owners didn't even know what a mouse was. For many, it was a novelty to be installed, fiddled with for an afternoon, and then quietly abandoned for the comforting speed of the DOS prompt. But inside Microsoft's Redmond headquarters, the setback wasn't treated as a failure. It was treated as version 1. Bill Gates had always been more interested in the long game than in winning the launch day. As he saw it, Windows wasn't just software, it was an inevitability. Hardware was getting faster, memory was becoming cheaper, and the GUI would eventually be the norm. Microsoft simply needed to hold its position until the rest of the world caught up. The first signs of progress came with Windows 2.0 in December 1987. The update seemed modest on the surface, improved graphics, more memory support, a redesigned control panel, but it included a key visual change: overlapping windows. Now, programs could stack naturally like sheets of paper, instead of sitting side by side in rigid tiles. It was a direct shot at Apple's interface philosophy. The move sparked a legal war. In 1988, Apple filed a lawsuit claiming Microsoft had copied 189 distinct elements of the Macintosh GUI. The case would stretch on for 6 years before Microsoft ultimately prevailed, but the tension between the two tech giants became part of the very DNA of the PC industry. More importantly, Windows 2.0 marked the arrival of Microsoft's killer apps in graphical form. Excel and Word began shipping as Windows-native applications, and their integration with the OS was deliberate. If the best Office software ran best on Windows, customers would follow, and they did. Corporations began experimenting with Windows machines not just as oddities, but as serious workstations. Then came the turning point. Windows 3.0 launched in May 1990. This was the moment when Windows stopped being an awkward extra and started becoming the PC's default environment. Powered by the growing horsepower of Intel's 80286 and 80,386 processors, Windows 3.0 could multitask smoothly enough to feel modern. Its redesigned Program Manager and File Manager gave users intuitive access to applications and files. The 256-color VGA graphics mode transformed screens from dull grays into vibrant canvases. Microsoft didn't just rely on technical upgrades. It marketed Windows 3.0 with precision. Developers were courted aggressively. Hardware manufacturers were encouraged to preload the OS. And in a masterstroke of subtle genius, the package included Solitaire, a game whose real purpose was to train users to drag and drop with a mouse. The effect was electric. In just 6 months, Microsoft sold 2 million copies of Windows 3.0. Within a year, it was the most popular GUI for IBM-compatible PCs, cementing Microsoft's place as the leader of the desktop revolution. By the time Windows 3.1 launched in April 1992, complete with scalable TrueType fonts and multimedia support, the graphical interface wasn't just a nice extra. It was what people expected from a computer. And then came the Big Bang, Windows 95. Unveiled on August 24, 1995, with a $300 million marketing budget and the Rolling Stones' Start Me Up blasting across television ads, Windows 95 was more than a software launch. It was a cultural event. Crowds lined up outside electronics stores at midnight to get their hands on it. The Start menu became an instant icon. The taskbar simplified multitasking, and plug-and-play hardware support made adding peripherals painless, at least in theory. In its first 5 weeks, Windows 95 sold 7 million copies. The operating system became the standard for both home and office PCs, and Microsoft's dominance of the software world solidified to a level that few companies in any industry have ever achieved. But as history would prove, when you reach the top of the mountain, the winds get stronger and competitors start plotting to knock you down. The turning point was about to arrive. By the mid-1990s, Microsoft's dominance over the PC world was almost absolute. Windows 95 had become the default interface for both home users and corporate America. Developers flocked to write software for it. PC manufacturers pre-installed it as a matter of course. Bill Gates, once the scrappy underdog, was now the most powerful figure in the technology industry and one of the richest men in the world. But technology rarely sits still. In 1994 and 1995, a new force was emerging from universities and research labs: the Internet. Once the realm of academics and hobbyists, the web was suddenly accessible to the public thanks to graphical browsers like Netscape Navigator. For a brief moment, the browser itself seemed poised to become the new computing platform, a layer that could run on any operating system, potentially eroding the importance of Windows. Microsoft was slow to react. Gates himself later admitted that he initially underestimated the web's potential. But once he recognized the threat, the company pivoted hard. In August 1995, just a week after Windows 95 launched, Gates sent his now famous Internet Tidal Wave memo, declaring the web the single most important development since the IBM PC. Microsoft rushed to release Internet Explorer, first as a modest add-on, then integrated directly into the Windows operating system. That decision would change the company's fate, and not entirely for the better. Netscape accused Microsoft of using its OS monopoly to crush competition by bundling Internet Explorer for free and tying it into the desktop environment. The U.S. Department of Justice took notice. In 1998, the government filed an antitrust lawsuit against Microsoft, accusing it of illegally maintaining its monopoly and stifling innovation. The trial was a media spectacle. Prosecutors painted Microsoft as a ruthless giant using its dominance to choke out rivals. Gates' videotaped deposition, in which he appeared evasive and combative, did nothing to help the company's image. In November 1999, Judge Thomas Penfield Jackson issued his findings. Microsoft had indeed violated antitrust laws. The proposed penalty was severe: a breakup of the company into two entities, one for the operating system and one for applications. For months, it seemed that Microsoft's empire might be forcibly dismantled. While appeals were underway, another shift was happening. Apple, left for dead in the early 90s, had brought back Steve Jobs in 1997 and was working on a radical overhaul of its operating system, laying the groundwork for Mac OS X. At the same time, the open-source movement was gaining momentum, with Linux positioning itself as a free, customizable alternative to Windows. In 2001, the breakup order was overturned on appeal, and Microsoft reached a settlement with the Justice Department that imposed restrictions on its business practices but allowed it to remain whole. On the surface, the company had survived the legal onslaught, but the fight had cost it precious time, attention, and public goodwill. As the new millennium began, Microsoft faced a very different tech landscape. The web was king, new competitors were rising, and even its most loyal customers were beginning to wonder if the Windows era might not last forever. In the shadow of the antitrust storm, Microsoft prepared to launch what would become one of its most beloved products. On October 25, 2001, Windows XP arrived, a blend of the stability and security of the Windows NT architecture with a consumer-friendly interface of Windows 95/98. It introduced a colorful new theme, Luna, with bright blues, rounded edges, and that iconic green start button. XP was more than an upgrade. It was a statement that Microsoft was still in control. It booted faster, crashed less, and offered a smoother plug-and-play experience. Networking was simpler, USB device support was rock solid, and the OS came with built-in tools for everything from digital photography to CD burning. Businesses adopted it in droves. Home users adored it. But in a twist that would haunt Microsoft for years, XP, was too good. Its reliability and familiarity meant users saw little reason to upgrade. Instead of a steady progression of sales, XP entrenched itself, running on hundreds of millions of machines well into the next decade. Meanwhile, Microsoft's ambition swelled. Codenamed Longhorn, the next version of Windows was supposed to be revolutionary, a complete reimagining of the OS with a flashy 3D desktop, integrated search, and a new file system called WinFS. But development faltered. By 2004, after a series of devastating security vulnerabilities, the Blaster and Sasserworms chief among them, Microsoft halted Longhorn's progress to focus on securing XP through Service Pack 2. That security update was critical and widely praised, but it pushed Longhorn years behind schedule. When it finally emerged in January 2007 as Windows Vista, expectations were sky-high. Microsoft poured hundreds of millions into marketing, promising the wow would start now. But the wow was quickly replaced by groans. Vista demanded powerful hardware that many PCs of the time couldn't handle. The new user account control prompts were incessant. Driver support was spotty, breaking printers, scanners, and even some high-end graphics cards. Businesses refused to upgrade, sticking with XP. Apple, sensing blood in the water, mocked Vista relentlessly in its "I'm a Mac" / "I'm a PC" ads. Vista became a cautionary tale. Even the most dominant software could lose the public's trust overnight. Microsoft's redemption came just 2 years later. In October 2009, it released Windows 7, essentially Vista's core with years of optimization, polish, and restraint. It booted faster, ran leaner, and kept the best of Vista's features, like improved search and the Arrow interface, without the baggage. Critics hailed it as what Vista should have been, an adoption sword. Within a year, Windows 7 was the fastest-selling operating system in history, with over 240 million licenses sold. Yet, even as Microsoft celebrated, the world was changing again. In January 2007, Steve Jobs had unveiled the iPhone, and in 2008, Google's Android platform began its meteoric rise. The center of innovation shifted from the desktop to mobile devices. Microsoft's Windows Mobile, designed for stylus-driven PDAs, felt archaic in the new touch-first era. Efforts to catch up, like Windows Phone 7 in 2010 and the Metro design language, won critical praise but not market share. In 2012, determined to bridge the PC and mobile worlds, Microsoft launched Windows 8. It was bold, risky, and divisive. The Start menu was replaced by a full-screen start screen with live tiles, optimized for touch devices. On tablets, it worked well. On desktops, it felt jarring and inefficient. Many users revolted, clinging to Windows 7 or seeking workarounds to restore the Start menu. By the mid-2010s, Microsoft faced an identity crisis. The PC market was shrinking, mobile had slipped away to Apple and Google, and Windows, once the undisputed center of personal computing, had to fight for relevance. Still, if history had taught anything, it was that Microsoft's greatest strength was not perfection, but persistence. By the time Windows 10 arrived in July 2015, Microsoft had learned some hard lessons. The mobile war was largely lost. iOS and Android ruled the pocket, but the desktop was still a fortress worth defending. The company pitched Windows 10 as a reconciliation, familiar to Windows 7 loyalists, modern enough to carry forward the touch-centric ideas of Windows 8, and built as a service that would evolve continuously rather than being replaced every few years. The Start menu returned, blending live tiles with the classic list of programs. Virtual desktops let users organize their workflows. Cortana, Microsoft's voice assistant, joined the fray. Security was prioritized, with features like Windows Hello facial recognition and a hardened Edge browser. And, perhaps most importantly, Windows 10 was offered as a free upgrade for its first year, a move designed to wipe away the fragmentation that had plagued Microsoft during the Vista/Windows 8 years. The strategy worked. By 2020, Windows 10 was running on over 1 billion devices, from desktops and laptops to ATMs, factory control systems, and even the occasional space station terminal. It wasn't flawless. Updates sometimes broke features or caused reboots at inconvenient times, but it reasserted Windows' place as the backbone of global computing. The influence of Windows goes beyond numbers. For billions, it has defined the mental model of what a computer is. The start menu, the double-click, the taskbar, the minimize/maximize/close buttons. These have become cultural shorthand for computing itself. The Windows chime, startup sound, is as instantly recognizable as a doorbell. The blue screen of death, dreaded and mimetic, is part of our shared tech folklore. Economically, Windows powered entire industries. From accounting firms running Excel to designers using Photoshop, from hospitals tracking patients to teenagers building their first video games, Windows provided the platform. Its dominance shaped hardware design, drove the PC's cost downward, and gave rise to the global software development economy. And yet, its legacy is complicated. Windows represents innovation, but also monopoly power. It's been celebrated for connecting the world and criticized for stifling competition. It has brought convenience to billions, but also opened the floodgates to viruses, malware, and spam in the early internet era. Its history is a mirror of the tech industry itself: ambition, dominance, hubris, and reinvention. Bill Gates once said, "We always overestimate the change that will occur in the next 2 years and underestimate the change that will occur in the next 10. Windows is living proof. From a clunky tiled experiment in 1985 to an omnipresent operating system woven into the fabric of modern life, it has been both underestimated and overestimated, but never irrelevant. From flickering CRTs in a modest Redmond office to the glow of billions of screens worldwide, the saga of Microsoft Windows is the story of a company's relentless pursuit of relevance. It's a reminder that technology's greatest force isn't perfection, it's persistence. In 1985, Windows was easy to dismiss. For decades later, it remains the lens through which